So welcome everyone. I'm Megan Buckley of the DC Sentencing Commission. I am our general counsel. I already see quite a few familiar names on our attendee list, so I'm excited to have all of you here to discuss our 2025 manual. Brittany has also set up our chat, or I think the question and answer. So I'm going to do my best to check periodically throughout, but there will definitely be time at the end as well to ask any questions, whether it's about the 2025 manual or just burning questions you've been wanting to ask the commission. And this is your great opportunity to do so. But I want to thank you so much for attending. So why don't we dive in? We're going to be touching today on the 2025 manual that just released, but at the beginning of our presentation, we're really going to be highlighting, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with our organization, talking about the Sentencing Commission, and then ultimately a brief overview of the guidelines themselves. So for those unfamiliar, the DC Sentencing Commission is a small independent agency with the DC government. Our statutory membership has 15 voting members and 5 non-voting members that sit on the commission. Our current membership is 18 members, and we have 8 staff members, like Brittany, myself, Lyndon, who are on staff, although we do have one position we are currently looking for a statistician. So the Sentencing Commission was set up to implement and support the sentencing guidelines of the District of Columbia. And the guidelines really are intended to ensure that we're seeing fair and consistent sentencing policies throughout the district. So how we do that is ultimately by evaluating the effectiveness of the guideline system. The commission actually receives data from the DC Superior Court every day regarding felony sentences. We really then take a look at that data to ultimately recommend any policy changes. We are a data-driven agency, so any considerations made, any suggestions are really taken through a data-driven approach. All right. Sorry, I just want to make sure I have the chat up. Okay, so the commission is ultimately a resource. So again, I saw a lot of familiar names on the attendee here today. So I think a lot of you know that the commission really aims to be available every day to answer questions about the application of the guidelines. So we assist users with applying the guidelines in either their specific cases or answering general questions. Now, I do want to note that any advice given by the Sentencing Commission is not binding on the court, and we cannot provide legal advice. But we do, again, answer questions daily. Out of district scoring, all other questions. I think out of district scoring is the one we most receive questions on. And then we also receive data requests, whether it's from the DC Council, the public, anyone can request data from the commission. So the commission publishes a multitude of publications, but we have 2 main publications. Our annual report, which we are currently finalizing right now. This is statutorily mandated, and we are required to report on judicial compliance. What felony sentences are being done in the Superior Court, and then are they following the guidelines recommendations? But we ultimately also publish a wealth of additional information, including sentencing trends over that year. So we'll be printing the 2024, so sentencing trends seen throughout 2024, and then ultimately comparing that as well to sentencing trends we've seen over the past decade. We produce this by April 30th, so you can expect to see this coming very soon as well. And Brittany just put in the chat our annual report presentation as well. So if you would be looking for a high-level review of those data pieces, I think that that is a really excellent way to receive that information, not just review it through the annual report. If you'd like to review the annual report as well, you can sign up for our newsletter. The other main publication piece we typically publish yearly is our guidelines manual. We did not have one come out in 2024, and we'll get into that throughout this presentation. As you can see the significant update that 2025 manual went through. But it's starting in 2026, we aim to have the manual come out every year to be effective on January 1st. So you can expect it around probably mid-December, the PDF, and then the printed copies again, probably around that same time, if not by January 1st. We also potentially have guidelines alerts for in-year changes. So most often that ends up being, as we saw with Secure DC, ranking of new offenses. But if there are any other updates made by the commission to the manual throughout that process, guidelines alert are issued. Again, the best way to receive those is through our newsletter. We also have some additional publications that can be found on our website: Fast Facts, issue papers, 11C1C reports. We are evaluating trends that we're seeing through 11C1C pleas in the DC Superior Court. And we're also now publishing some data responses that we are receiving that we think would be of particular interest to the public. Again, all of this information can be found on our website. But let's talk about why we're all here, which is the 2025 Guidelines Manual. So the manual just came out. It was effective April 1st. The new cover, I'm biased, but I think it looks like a very significant update, is on your screen. So we're going to be really touching on the significant structural updates to the manual. So as Lyndon touched on, it is the manual we all know and appreciate, and the same ultimately guidelines rules displayed differently. So today's presentation is really going to highlight those differences, especially for people who have come to rely on our manual and are very used to its format, where things are, the citations and things like that, to hopefully make this process a little bit more less daunting, because we do feel it is a significant improvement overall. We hope you will feel the same as well. Visuals have been increased. Almost all of the examples have also been updated with visuals, use of color, and overall just written to update and answer questions that the commission has often received. Now, there were some minor substantive changes, so I can't say that it was entirely a non-substantive update, but they were minor and ultimately meant to address some holes we saw once we implemented the structural update. So these changes aren't meant to ultimately change how offenses are scored or things like that, are just meant to fill some of the holes we saw, but are consistent with current and previous guidelines policy in the 2023 manual. All right. If there are any questions throughout, please don't hesitate to put them in, whether it's the chat box, or I think there was the question and answer box as well. All right. So today, again, we're going to be touching on the overall features of the guidelines. So I'm going to give a very brief high-level overview of the guidelines themselves for anyone not familiar, and just to orient us in this presentation. But the bulk of our time is going to be talking about the differences between the 2023 manual and the 2025 manual. If anyone would like a Guidelines 101 refresher or more information about the guidelines, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or the commission itself after this presentation to set up. We do individual trainings. We're happy to come to your agency, your group, and provide a training as well. So this is not intended to be an overall Guidelines 101, but just a brief overview. So diving in, the guidelines were created to promote certainty, consistency, and adequacy of punishment in the DC Superior Court's felony sentences. When we have two defendants who have committed similar crimes with similar criminal histories, they should be receiving similar sentences ultimately. When we're looking at the guidelines recommended sentences and looking at what the recommendation is, there are only two primary factors that the guidelines take into consideration when making that determination: the criminal history score of the defendant and the seriousness of the offense or offenses that are being sentenced for that day. Those are the only two pieces of information that ultimately go into coming up with that recommendation. Now, the guidelines are voluntary, so sentencing judges are only obligated to give a legal sentence. Sentencing judges can interpret the guidelines rules, ultimately determine the defendant's criminal history score, and then take their judgment and decide, is it appropriate to follow the guidelines in this case, or is it more appropriate to depart for a variety of reasons? Ultimately, it's for the judge to determine what the appropriate sentence is. All right. So again, I really do want to emphasize that the rules of the manual and how to figure out the guidelines recommended sentence have not changed. So on your screen should hopefully, if you've taken a guidelines training from us before, familiar with the guidelines, the walkthrough of how to come up with the guidelines recommendation. It's the exact same way that it has always been. So we are locating the offense severity group for the offense or offenses that are being sentenced that day. We then determine the defendant's criminal history score, which, as we know, can be very complicated to not complicated at all, just varies by defendant in that case. And then you just take those two pieces of information and go back to our grids to determine the recommended sentencing range and the sentence type. There, in some cases, are enhancements or special rules that may apply, and the guidelines do address those as well. Oftentimes that isn't the case, but that is something to consider if it is applicable in that case. Now, the guidelines has two grids, as you see, and we'll talk about the updates in a minute, but our grids are the same. We have our drug grid, which ranks all felony drug offenses in the district, and our main grid, which ranks all other felony offenses in the district. They work in the exact same way. The offense severity group 1 on both is the most severe offenses, and then they move down in severity till you get to offense severity group 4 on the drug grid and offense severity group 9 on the main grid. We also move across for criminal history score. Again, both grids are the same. So the numbering, the numerical values for every criminal history score column are the same, whether you're on the drug grid or on the main grid. We move from no to little criminal history score in group column A of criminal history score all the way up to 6 points plus in column E. Now, our first step, again, is finding the offense severity group. Sometimes that can be very simple. It's already listed on one of our grids, which has the most common offenses in the district. But this is for, again, the instant offense or offenses that are being sentenced that day. And the commission only ranks felony offenses. So if it's not on the grids, or if you're just looking for additional information, Appendix C is really where you want to be looking. It provides the statute, whether it's a crime of violence, fine amount, a whole wealth of information. So whether it's an offense you're familiar with or less familiar with, I do really recommend that people check out Appendix C's great reference tool. But that is going to give us what the offense severity group is for that offense. Once we have that information, we then determine the criminal history score of the defendant. So what are we considering in how we add up the points to determine a defendant's criminal history score? We are only looking at final convictions and adjudications. There must have been a judgment of guilt. That means deferred sentencing agreements, deferred plea agreements, probations before judgment, stead dockets. Those are not final judgments of guilt, so they are not going to move our box and be counted toward a defendant's criminal history score. Now, the defendant must have already been sentenced for it, and it can't be part of the instant event. Now, when we are looking at this, we want to see what the defendant was actually convicted of or pled guilty to. So this is determined by the plea agreement, the verdict. Again, not necessarily not what they were initially charged with, but what they were found guilty of. That is going to be governing how we are scoring these offenses. Now, ultimately, the offense severity group determines the scoring. We're going to talk about that more in a second. And again, we don't want to be considering conduct part of the same instant event. We don't want to double count and criminalize something that the defendant, if it's already part of what they're being convicted of that day. So as you can see, based on how we are figuring out what point value to give prior criminal history points, the offense severity group has an incredible impact based on that, whether it's M1 through M5, a drug offense, a misdemeanor. So that's the piece of information why we need to know how that offense would be scored by the district and then looking to our table. What also can impact it is whether it's an adult conviction, a juvenile adjudication, has it lapsed and revived, etc. The grids also give that same information. So on our left side column, it also highlights, again, just based on the offense severity group, what the point value is for that offense. Once you have these two pieces of information, we can now go back to our grids to determine what the guidelines recommended range and sentence type are. So if we have a defendant who has a robbery conviction, that places them in main group 6, M6. So now we know what column we're in, and we know they have a criminal history score of 2. We go to our criminal histories, and we see that places them in column C. Take those two pieces of information, and we know that they are in box M6C, which has a recommended range of 30 to 72 months. Now, if a defendant were not to receive a sentence that falls in 30 to 72 months, the commission would consider that a durational departure. Now, our grids not only have a recommended range, the colors also give a recommended sentence type. So the colors refer to what the available sentence types are. The white color means that a prison sentence, prison, or a long split are the only available sentence types in those boxes. Dark blue boxes allow for prison, long split, or short split, and light blue boxes allow for prison, long split, short split, or probation. So to be clear, prison and long split are available in all boxes, but they are the only available sentence types available in white boxes. Short splits are available in the light blue and dark blue boxes, and then probation sentences are only available in the light blue boxes. All right. Again, that was meant as a very short overview of the guidelines manual. If you've taken a training from me, you know I can talk on and on about this. So hopefully that was helpful. But if you would like an additional training or a refresher, please don't hesitate to reach out to the commission and let us know. So let's dive into now discussing the changes to the 2025 manual. One of the things I also would like to highlight is we have a very helpful tool on our website that goes through and compares the 2023 manual's table of contents to the 2025 manual's contents. So especially if you are looking for a specific piece of information that maybe I'm not highlighting today, or just might be something helpful to have on your desk if you are a frequent user of the manual, and this is obviously a bigger shift for you, we created that additional reference tool to help walk users through these changes just to know what you're looking for and to make everyone's lives simpler. So that can also be found on our website. All right, so one of the easiest ways to see what these structural updates are is, again, to compare it to the table of contents of the 2023 manual. This is something that, oh, and Brittany just popped it in the chat box as well. Thank you, Brittany. So if you were looking for that, click right on that link and you'll be able to see that as well as we go through this presentation. So the 2023 manual table of contents. This table of contents, while the manual itself has been updated since its inception in 2004, has not been structurally updated since that creation, which means that when additional updates were made, different discussions, things were inserted in rather than shifted around, which wasn't a bad approach. But then when we looked at the document wholesale, we realized that it could be significantly shifted around to break up discrete topics to not have them clumped together. So on your screen is now our 2025 manual table of contents. And while I'm incredibly biased, I do think that it makes a lot more sense. It follows a guidelines training. It walks the user through the process of how we determine a guideline sentence, but also has these common topics that we are most often seeing as questions in their own chapters or separated out. For example, again, we receive a significant amount of questions. I would say 80% of our questions regard out of district scoring. In the 2023 manual, that was buried in chapter 2. It is now its own chapter in chapter 5 because of how many questions received and to really make clear these issues discreetly to make it easier to find for a user for this common topic and common questions. The other thing we did in the structural update, again, these are not substantive changes, but to make it easier for the user, is we have broken everything out into discrete sections and subsections and labeled them. This makes it easier to cite in your memos or to include when you're responding to counsel, or even just in a conversation that the commission is having when we're answering your questions, to make it easier for us to pinpoint that piece of information and what is a rule to you. So chapter 4 is on our screens right now, just to walk through as an example where we're just talking discreetly about lapse and revival rules, and then walking through these issues into discrete subsections. All right. Another useful tool was adding additional table of contents to make it easier to find things that you might be looking for. All of the tables in the manual are now labeled, and they also have a table of tables, so we can easily pinpoint where that information is. The same with examples. Some examples were in text, some listed as notes, some were in appendixes. We now have them all in text in a separate box labeled with a note next to what the concept is. And then we also have a table of examples. So if you're looking for something quickly, you can find it. And an abbreviation and acronym list, again, to increase usability. All right. We updated all of the examples with a few exceptions to really update either with common questions we've been seeing, update the offenses to increase variety, and just really address discrete topics throughout the manual and then placing them with those topics. So we've increased the use of colors. You can see One of the nice things we've also done that I think will be incredibly helpful is we've included the reason for how we've then come to that conclusion. So we'll cite the rule. There's also footnotes. They're just not included in the PowerPoint just to make it easier to view this. But all of the reasons then both have the citation as well as a footnote explaining, and then you can go back to that section of the manual. So I do think it just makes it easier for the reader to understand why this is the answer to work through those problems. So I'm going to walk through the table of contents, or really the breakdown of the new structural changes to the manual, again, to emphasize why this is not a ultimately substantive overall update, and just to show everyone, again, who's really familiar with our manual, where these topics that you were previously used to in other sections are now located in the manual to, again, hopefully make this less daunting. But if anyone ever has any questions or just want help locating anything in the manual or just anything, please never hesitate to reach out. But the first chapter is really just an overall view of the guidelines. Now, one of the biggest changes that I'm sure everyone saw as part of the beginning of this presentation was our grids. So everyone is used to our drug grid, which previously looked like this. However, the drug grid now has been significantly updated to look like this. Now, it is not a substantive change. The ranges haven't changed, what boxes have short split or probation, but it is a visual update. I think the blue is a little bit nicer on the eyes than the yellow and green, but it also color copies better for grayscale and is easier for anyone who has issues with potentially color blindness or other things. So it was a visual update, but it is ultimately our same grids. The other update to the grids is what was formerly called the master grid is now known as the main grid. Again, substantively, this is still the same grid, same ranges, no changes in that way. So we are referring to it now as the main grid. Everything else is the same. So if you hear OSG M1, that is still referring to this grid, which is now the main grid. All right. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of the 2023 manual really went through a variety of topics, but now it is just determining the offense severity group. So again, that is what is being sentenced for that day. That is that one discrete topic. But I do think just seeing how Chapter 2 was broken up into the 2025 manual really shows how many topics it was covered and how it could become difficult to kind of find the topic that you're looking for and how the interplay is. So we've now broken Chapter 2 into 4 different chapters. So this is just, again, you will see the same information on that 2023 table of contents chart I mentioned for you, but just I think is a helpful walkthrough of seeing Chapter 5 is now out of district. Some things are now in Chapter 4, Chapter 3, Chapter 2. So we really try to break it up so we address each topic logically in the flow of a guidelines training, but all of that information is still available. It's just now in new places in the manual that hopefully make a little bit more sense in finding it as you're in court or need to search for something. Chapter 3 then deals with calculating the criminal history score. Again, what used to be combined as part of Chapter 2 is really a separate step, right? We're figuring out then the criminal history score for prior convictions. We're not talking about the instant offense anymore. So on your screen is really the just chapter breakdown of Chapter 3. So as we can see, we talk about a multitude of issues, whether it's from a single event, prior convictions and adjudications, accessory after the fact issues. This table of contents also just makes it a bit easier to find the discrete issue you're looking for, whereas before, this information was in the manual, but wasn't as clearly labeled. One of the questions we most often get is how to determine if something is an event or just even discussing an event. So we wanted to make sure that that was addressed in the appropriate places as part of the new structural changes, but also make sure that the definition wasn't just placed in the glossary. And I would say that this was a common thing that we did find was that most often something was potentially only addressed either in appendix or a glossary. We wanted to make sure that the main rule was in the main text of the actual manual. So an event is a perfect example of that. It is now discussed in the first chapter in section 1.3.7. It is defined in 10.15 now of the glossary. And we work through, again, this is the same rule. It has not been substantively changed, but we now have different places where it applies. So chapter 3, it's in different places where we have talking about multiple offenses from a single event, whether prior convictions are part of the same event. This really helps walk the user through how this interplays, where again, this is a common question where ultimately the commission can't make a factual determination, but makes it easier for us to provide additional information so that the parties can make their arguments, the judge can make that determination. This is another common page that was cited in the 2023 and prior versions of the manual. If you've ever taken a guidelines training with me, you've known I call this my favorite guidelines manual page. So this is page 8 of the 2023 manual. Again, it includes a breadth of information: how to score prior offenses, rules on contempt, juvenile adjudications, misdemeanors. However, this was the only place that this information was given. We've actually received quite a bit of comments recently, just before the release of the new manual, that was asking where even the rules were spelled out. For example, scoring what is now the main groups 1 through 5 as an adult conviction, right? This was the only place that this rule was, and it was a visual table. So the rule was not changed, but we broke it out where we both have the table we all know and appreciate, but now the rules are written out. So I really want to emphasize this is not a substantive update. These are just now spelled out. So whether again you need to cite it for your memorandum, just know where to pull up the rule. These are now broken up into discrete sections of the manual. So we now have section 3.3.1a, which talks about felony offenses on the main grid. Subsection B walks through the drug grid. A separate section on misdemeanors, how we talk about the convictions cap, what offenses are not going to be scored, juvenile adjudications as well. All of that same information that is in the table, the same rules, just now also spelled out in reference to make it easier for understanding. Juvenile adjudications as well are broken up into the main grid offenses and drug grid offenses. Another common question we receive is scoring marijuana related convictions. So we wanted to make sure that this section was also made clear, where before it was, again, stuck in chapter 2 in a very specific subsection. So I'm not going to walk through the rule today, but again, because this is a common question, I did want to highlight now where to find it, which is section 3.7.1 of the new manual. So again, this makes it easier for if this is an issue that you're dealing with to highlight and walk through. One of the nice things we've also done is add a specific example about marijuana convictions or overall drug convictions if the drug is unknown, that walks through the rules of this offense and I think answers some of the common questions we most receive. So this example can be found right underneath that section. And again, really walks through how we increase the use of color and explaining out kind of the different ways that the guidelines rules work. All right. Chapter 4 is now lapse and revival. Again, this is one of our more complex topics of the guidelines, so we wanted to make sure it received its own chapter because some prior convictions, this doesn't come into play, right? We just have our 10-year window, the offense hasn't lapsed, but others, this can have a huge impact and has a couple different issues. We can have lapsed and revived convictions. Maybe the order of sentencing will have an impact on whether offenses have lapsed and revived or what the scoring is. Out of district convictions. So we wanted to work through all of these discrete issues, again, rather than kind of clumping them all together into chapter 2. The lapse and revival chapter is another chapter that I think also walks through how the increased use of visuals and color play an important part in this new manual. So based on feedback we've received with guidelines trainings, we have updated all of the visuals as well in the manual to also make it easier for understanding, right? Everyone learns in different ways, whether someone's a visual learner, whether someone reads or things like that. So especially with lapse and revival, visuals have been increasingly helpful in our trainings in walking through, seeing what the 10-year window is and whether something has lapsed, we've fallen outside our 10-year window, or where something could potentially revive. So we, again, have really used color to make it clear whether something's scored, whether something's lapsed and revived, or whether it's not scored. So the lapse and revival examples are a bit longer because they have a lot of graphics, but again, these are really intended to help the user understand these really complex topics. Chapter 5 is everyone's favorite topic, out of district scoring. So, again, what we received the majority of our questions on. So, when you start to hear responses from the commission, you're no longer going to hear 2.2.5. We're going to be referencing this chapter. This is really intended just to deal with these discrete issues of what is the rule for out of district scoring if there's no comparable offense, how to score an out of district offense when the defendant was less than 18. Is it from a special jurisdiction? Maybe it was a foreign conviction, military tribunal. All of these, again, just make it easier to find. None of these were new, other than tribal convictions were added, again, because this was just a hole that we determined as we were structurally updating the manual, but it follows current and previous 2023 guidelines policy. We also have a specific section outlined for challenging. Again, another common question we receive about out of district scoring, right? We have an initial score and then we have our potential other score, or maybe I just disagree overall, right? You're taking a look at it and you don't agree that that is what the offense is for your client. This is a bit more easily outlined to find it, cite it in your memorandum or when you're reaching out to co-counsel. Chapter 6 then shifts to sentencing within the box. After we walk through all these chapters, we now know how to find the offense severity group, how to find the prior criminal history score. Now we need to know how or then are we looking at these guidelines recommended ranges and also what the sentence types are. So chapter 6, I think, received a significant visual update. For those of you familiar with prior versions of our manual, we previously had Appendix E, which walked through split sentences and had some visuals. We have now included these visuals and said in the actual text of the sections to walk the user through both what a compliant sentence type is for each type of sentence, as well as give examples of non-compliant sentence types based on common questions we've received, just to make things easier. And again, also use color in case that is helpful just for the visual representation for people. We do this for all types, not just split sentences. So the new sections walk through first a prison sentence. Then we're going to walk through a long split. Again, we're showing both what a compliant long split looks like, non-compliant split sentence, which again, we're receiving a lot of questions about. Judges are still able to give a legal sentence, but we are advising on how, if the intention is to give a guidelines compliant sentence, how you go about doing that, or if it's an above the box sentence. Short split's the same thing, how to give a compliant short split sentence, then if it's a non-compliant split or below the box, for example, and then probation. At the end of the section, we actually then walk through a probation box and all potential types of sentences that could be given in that. Because remember, just because a defendant is in a probation eligible box does not mean that they are obligated to receive a probation eligible sentence. A defendant in a probation eligible box can receive a probation sentence, a short split sentence, a long split, or a prison sentence. So we walk through the different ways a defendant could receive a guidelines compliant sentence for all of those types in that singular box. The other piece that we found wasn't specifically addressed in the main text of the manual, but is a really important part in all of our discussions, right? What's one thing we keep talking about often, or even just in reaching out to the commission? What is a compliant sentence? Compliance was really discussed mainly in our annual report as we were talking about our numbers and how we were reviewing those offenses. This is now included as well, not just in our glossary, but in the main text of the manual. This is not substantive change. This is just what has been previous commission policy. Make sure that it is clear just to give additional information. The section also walks through what compliant outside of the box sentences look like. Again, just to make it easier to understand what the options are. All right, so additional guidance that the manual gives are Chapter 7 is consecutive, concurrent, and sentences, and then judicial discretion, potentially. Chapter 7 is the only chapter in the manual that I would say did not receive a significant update. As many of you know, the consecutive concurrent chapter, what was Chapter 6, was recently updated in about the past 2 years with increased new examples and increasing examples, as well as just adapted for ease of understanding based on common questions. That was really a huge impetus to how we ended up approaching this topic or in making these structural changes is seeing the feedback and information we received about that chapter. So that chapter ultimately remains the same. It is just now chapter 7. Chapter 8 talks about departure principles, aggravating factors, mitigating factors, Rule 11C1C, please. Again, all of the previous factors are all the same, just now in a different chapter. Chapter 9 breaks down indeterminate sentences, revocation of sentences, and not following the guidelines. All right. Now, because of the restructuring of the manual, different parts of the 2023 manual were either redundant, they've been moved around from the appendixes, or they were just seen to no longer be necessary. However, the commission didn't want to entirely get rid of what has been helpful to people in the past, so we've now created supplements on our website. So we have the main text of our manual, but we have some what were formerly appendixes now as supplements that can be found on our website. So Appendix CI, which is the chart and order of DC code citation. So the Appendix C is alphabetical order. CI has always just been by DC code citation. That is now online as Supplement 1. Appendix D, or what was Appendix D, the ranking chart, the most common offense, is Supplement 2. Chapter 8, frequently asked questions. A lot of these have, again, been addressed now with the structural updates, the way that the manual has been updated. But again, just in case people find them helpful, they're familiar, they're included as Supplement 3. Chapter 9 are the previous hypotheticals. Again, all of the examples in the manual are now in text in their specific sections and address these. So these are considered redundant, but may be helpful. And is now in Supplement 4. Appendix E, the guide to split sentences. Again, as I mentioned, the sentence type was updated in that chapter. So all those examples are there, but in case anyone would find it helpful to see the previous examples of split sentences, that is now Supplement 6 on the website. Appendix C of the new manual is offense listings. As we all know, Appendix A and B are 2 grids. Appendix D is the probation and supervised release. Appendix E are the fine amounts. Appendix F is statutory enhancements examples. And then Appendix G walks through these small substantive updates that I mentioned and just the overall changes to the manual. So the appendixes have not otherwise received a significant update, but do follow the visual and consistency changes of the manual. One of the other things to be looking forward to is this summer, we are currently working towards translating the manual, the 2025 manual, into Spanish. So if anyone has Spanish speaking clients or just Spanish is a language that is easier for people, that will increase accessibility to the guidelines. Now, I want to be clear that this translation is not intended to override the English manual. If there ever is any discrepancy between the language choices, the English manual is still going to govern. However, this is really meant to be as an additional way to increase accessibility based on feedback we've received about the manual. So moving forward again, we are going to be looking to have an effective date of January 1st of 2026 with a yearly schedule of a January 1st release. So we are currently on target for that. So our hope is to continue back to having yearly releases as well. 2024 is an outlier that we skipped a year. The best way to get information about this is to sign up for our newsletter. We also have our online supplements that I mentioned. We likely will be updating those as well in the coming year. And we also have some additional pieces of reference that are helpful. We have our top, middle, bottom, which were now been updated with our new grids. We also have the grids in years. I'm incredibly biased, but I can say for myself, when I look at J&Cs and different pieces of information, I'm going to a Google and typing in the months and making sure the years are right. So it's incredibly helpful. And we'll just have additional examples. So if there's additional examples that you think are missing from the manual or you would just find helpful, never hesitate to reach out. We really do take your suggestions seriously as users of the manual. So please never hesitate, whether it's a question or anything like that, because especially that common questions we received, user feedback, played a massive part in these structural changes that we took into consideration when this was made. We will also be updating the training video. The training video online has references to the 2023 manual. So again, it is still good. It is still the current rules. If you, it's me on the on the video. If you hear me cite a specific section, currently it's the 2023. So we also plan on updating that this year as well. Uh, we have different options of ways to additionally connect with us, again, to receive either updates, information about our monthly meetings with the commission members, if there's new information coming out, things like that. So we have what was Twitter is now X account, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Brittany updates all these amazingly well. So please connect with us. And again, that great ways to really stay connected with other information from the commission. And that is all the information. So I'm going to take a look at all the questions. I started to see some come in. I wasn't able to see the Q&A box, so I'll go back to that in a second and pull that up as well. But I'm happy to stay on to answer any and all questions anyone has. If you are looking for specific guidelines training, don't hesitate either to reach out to me or to the SDDC email. Again, we answer questions every workday. So whether it's out of district scoring, whether you are looking for other questions about the application of the guidelines, we are here as a resource to the users of the manual and to the public to give information. So never hesitate to reach out, even if it's just to confirm information. Lyndon can tell you I run to his office constantly to double check things. So we are here as a resource. So thank you all so much for attending. Again, I will answer any and all questions, but really, really appreciate your time. The manual is available online as a PDF. We do have limited printed copies. We're hoping to have more for 2026. But yeah, thank you all so much.